Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the fourth of the Ruskin readings under the overall title of Ruskin and the Crafts. Our galaxy of readers today consists of Déirdre Kelly, who lives and works as an artist in Venice. Her studio, which I visited, is at the Scuola Internazionale di Grafica, where she is the curator of the gallery. An exhibition of her work entitled Tracery, Venice and the Lakes Interlaced will open on the 20th of April at Brantwood in the Blue Gallery. Marcus Waithe is a University Associate Professor in English at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Magdalen College. Within the past few weeks, he's published two new books. One is a dialogue with the famous letter cutter, Vida Lopez Cardozo Kindersley, and the other is an intellectual tour de force entitled The Work of Words, Literature, Craft, and the Labour of Mind in Britain, 1830 to 1940. I have them both, and I'm very pleased that I do. Marcus also has the distinction of having written the brief and guided many aspects of the new library for the students of Magdalen College, Cambridge, which has been awarded the Sterling Prize for being the best new building in Britain. Ross Burgess is a graduate of the University of Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics, and also of the Open University in pure and applied mathematics. For many years, he was an IT consultant, but in retirement, he has turned to book editing and web design. He's currently researching and writing about the use of the classical orders in Scottish architecture and is a keen student of Ruskin's writings. I came to live in Scotland to be Director of Conservation and Property Services of the National Trust for Scotland. I've always been conscious of Ruskin's guiding influence on what we might call the National Trust movement, which now extends to more than 60 countries, in the sense that more than 60 countries have an organisation that they call the National Trust of Australia or wherever it is. And many of them are very active and very effective organisations. I work as an arts and heritage consultant, and I'm a board member of the Guild of St George with portfolios for international relationships. We have members in a dozen countries, and for craftspeople and craftsmanship, and both working internationally and respecting and encouraging the work of craftspeople have been lifelong enthusiasms and interests of mine. All four of us reading tonight are companions of the Guild of St George. Marcus is also chair of the Ruskin Society. We wish to dedicate this reading to the memory of sculptor and building artificer Rory Young, a dear friend of mine who read and spoke so memorably at the first session last December. He died of an inoperable cancer on the 23rd of February, and his funeral was yesterday. I will say more about him at the very end. Today's session focuses on what we can glean of Ruskin's passionate interest in the skills of craftspeople, including painters and sculptors, their materials and their methods, through his extensive travels in Europe, and indeed throughout his native land. What was Ruskin's native land? True, he was born in Hunter Square, Bloomsbury, London, in a house that was pulled down within living memory, though numerous small artifacts were rescued from it before the demolition began. But I always bear in mind that in Ruskin's first biography, The Life and Work of John Ruskin, by his close friend and secretary for many years, William Gershom Collingwood, published in 1893, the first words of the first chapter, headed The Ruskin Family, read as follows.
If origin, if early training and habits of life, if tastes and character and associations fix a man's nationality, then John Ruskin is a Scotsman. He was born in London, but his family was from Scotland. He was brought up in Surrey, but the friends and teachers, the standards and influences in his early life were chiefly Scottish. The writers who directed him into the main lines of his thought and work, not so much because he chose them as leaders, as because he was naturally brought under the spell of their inspiration, were Scotsmen, from Sir Walter Scott and Lord Lindsay and Principal Forbes, to the master of his later studies of men and the means of life, Thomas Carlyle. The religious instinct so conspicuous in him is a heritage from Scotland. So is his conscience and code of morality, part emotional, part logical, and often unlike an Englishman's in the points that satisfy or shock it. The combination of shrewd common sense and romantic sentiment, the oscillation between levity and dignity, from caustic jest to tender earnest, the restlessness, the fervour, the impetuosity, all these characteristics of a Scotsman of parts and highly developed in Ruskin.
Our first reading is from The Poetry of Architecture, or The Architecture of the Nations of Europe, considered in its association with natural scenery and national character, written while he was still an undergraduate at Oxford. It seems appropriate to introduce the reading with further helpful words from Collingwood's biography.
This piece of work, buried in a rarely seen periodical, is a valuable link in the development of his Seven Lamps, anticipating many of his conclusions of later days, and exhibiting his literary style as very near maturity. It deals with the countries he had visited, the English Lakeland, France, Switzerland, and North Italy. But some little notice of Spain suggests occasional collaboration with his father.
Our reading shows that Ruskin was one of the earliest writers to speak of the special qualities of vernacular buildings, that is, buildings built of local and natural materials, especially in our culture, stone and timber, designed not by architects or building surveyors, but chiefly by the men and women who were to live in them. The designers were most often also the builders, probably with help from their neighbours, including those with special skills. Here is his first encounter in Switzerland.
Well do I remember the thrilling and exquisite moment when first in my life, which had not been over long, I encountered in a calm and shadowy dingle, darkened with the thick spreading of tall pines, and voiceful with the singing of a rock-encumbered stream, and passing up towards the flank of a smooth green mountain, whose swarded summit shone in the summer snow like an emerald set in silver. When, I say, I first encountered in this calm defile of the Jura the unobtrusive yet beautiful front of the Swiss cottage, I thought it the loveliest piece of architecture I had ever the felicity of contemplating. Yet it was nothing in itself, nothing but a few mossy fir trunks, loosely nailed together with one or two grey stones on the roof. But its power was the power of association, its beauty that of fitness and humility.
Ruskin paid his first visit to the Jura on the continental tour he made with his parents in 1835. 50 years later, he recalled in Praeterita,
all Switzerland was there in hope and sensation, and what was less than Switzerland was in some sort better in its meek simplicity and healthy purity. The Jura cottage is not carved with the stately richness of the Bernese, nor set together with the antique strength of Uri. It is covered with thin slit pine shingles, side roofed, as it were, to the ground for mere dryness' sake. A little crossing of laths here and there under the window is only ornament. It has no daintiness of garden, nor wealth of farm about it. It is indeed little more than a delicately built chalet, yet trim and domestic, mildly intelligent of things other than pastoral, watchmaking and the like. Though set in the midst of the meadows, the gentian at its door, the lily of the valley wild in the copses hard by.
In the cottage section of the Poetry of Architecture, there is a chapter on chimneys dated 10th of February 1838, Oxford. The chapter contains a half page of drawings of 18 different types of chimney, as good as any architectural historian or building archaeologist of today might do. The text analyzes the different types, drawing attention especially to figure 9C, which is the chimney of a Westmoreland house discussed elsewhere in the text, as we shall see.
The good taste which prevailed in the rest of the building is not so conspicuous here, because the architect has begun to consider effect instead of utility, and has put a diamond-shaped piece of ornament on the front, usually containing the date of the building, which was not necessary and looks out of place. He has endeavoured to build neatly too, and has bestowed a good deal of plaster on the outside, by all which circumstances the work is infinitely deteriorated. We have always disliked cylindrical chimneys, probably because they put us in mind of glass houses and manufactories, for we are aware of no more definite reason, yet this example is endurable and has a character about it which it would be a pity to lose. Sometimes when the square part is carried down the whole front of the cottage, it looks like the remains of some grey tower and is not felt to be a chimney at all. Such deceptions are always very dangerous, though in this case sometimes attended with good effect, as in the old building called Coniston Hall on the shores of Coniston Water, whose distant outline is rendered light and picturesque by the size and the shape of its chimneys, which are the same in character as figure 9.
Ruskin would have known Coniston Hall from his extensive travels round England with his parents. Looking across from it to the west bank of Lake Coniston, he may well have at least glimpsed the Regency cottage, which we have on the screen now, which gradually extended, became his home from 1872 until his death in 1900, namely Brantwood, known and loved by, I imagine, almost all of us on the call tonight. During those later decades of his life, he became a passionate defender of the character of the Lake District, its buildings and landscapes, and the way of life of its inhabitants, including the craftspeople who built and maintained its dry stone walls, those who spun and wove its wool, those who made the characteristic vernacular furniture of the Lake District, and indeed all the skills that were necessary to maintain rural life. Returning to Scotland, there's an example of Ruskin lace, 2 examples in fact, on display in Brantwood last year. However, returning to Scotland, it is now time to recount the story of Ruskin's involvement with Dunblane Cathedral. In June 1853, Ruskin set off for a holiday in Scotland, accompanied by Effie, his wife, a friend of hers called Miss Mackenzie, John Everett Millais, the leading painter of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, so admired by Ruskin for their craftsmanlike but painterly skills, and Millais' brother, William. their journey is well recorded in letters from Ruskin to his father. The holiday began with staying at Wallington Hall, there it is, as the guests of Ruskin's friends, Sir Walter Trevelyan and his wife Pauline, who was a particular friend of Ruskin. Ruskin wrote to his father on the 23rd of June, 1853.
This is the most beautiful place possible, a large old 17th century stone house in an old English terrace garden, beautifully kept, all the hawthorns still in blossom, terrace opening on a sloping wild park down to the brook, about the half-a-mile fair slope, and woods on the other side, an undulating country with a peculiar Northumberlandishness about it, a faraway look which Millet enjoys intensely. We are all very happy, and going this afternoon over the moors to a little tarn where the seagulls come to feed.
After some days, the party set out for the Trossachs, made popular by Sir Walter Scott. Here's the entrance hall of his house, Abbotsford, as much a museum as a house. They visited many romantic places on the way, such as Melrose, Stirling, and indeed Dunblane. Ruskin was to use his drawings of Dunblane to illustrate the lectures which he was preparing to give in Edinburgh in the autumn of the same year. He wrote enthusiastically to his father from Doon on the 2nd of July, 1853.
We have just just dined at Stirling, drove on to Dunblane and saw the most lovely abbey there, far the finest thing I've seen in Scotland. Dunblane is exquisitely beautiful in its simplicity, grand concentric arches, and the oval window in the centre of the west end, set with 2 leaves, alternately sloping as in the margin, and the proportion of the whole quite heavenly. It is a lovely afternoon, and William Millet is half beside himself with delight, and all of us very happy.
Yeah, we can see the vesica-shaped window high up in the gable in the rather remarkable photograph on the left. During the weeks following, Ruskin was contentedly drawing and writing his lectures, while Millet began his famous portrait of Ruskin, which is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And I'm sure we all know it very well. Ruskin wrote to his father on the 6th of July as follows.
Millet has fixed on his place a lovely piece of warm rock, with foaming water and weeds and moss, and a noble overhanging bank of dark crag. And I am to be standing looking quietly down the stream, just the sort of thing I used to do for hours together. He is very happy at the idea of doing it, and I think you will be proud of the picture, and we shall have the 2 most wonderful torrents in the world, Turner's St. Gothard and Millet's Glenfield Lass. He is going to take the utmost possible pains with it, and says he can paint rocks and water better than anything else. I am sure the foam of the torrent will be something quite new in art.
Ruskin's lectures on architecture and painting were delivered at Edinburgh in November 1853 and published in 1854. In the first lecture on architecture, Ruskin gives one of his famous passages on looking to nature for inspiration.
Do you recollect the west window of your own Dunblane Abbey? If you look in any common guidebook, you will find it pointed out as peculiarly beautiful. It is acknowledged to be beautiful by the most careless observer. And why beautiful? Look at it. Simply because in its great contours, it has the form of a forest leaf, and because in its decoration, it has used nothing but forest leaves. The sharp and expressive moulding which surrounds it is a very interesting example of one used to an enormous extent by the builders of the early English Gothic. composed of clusters of 4 sharp leaves each, originally produced by sculpturing the sides of the 4-sided pyramid, and afterwards brought more or less into a true image of leaves, but deriving all its beauty from the botanical form. In the present instance, only 2 leaves are set in each cluster, and the architect has been determined that the naturalism should be perfect. For he was no common man who designed that cathedral at Dunblane. I know not anything so perfect in its simplicity and so beautiful as far as it reaches in all the Gothic with which I am acquainted. And just in proportion to his power of mind, that man was content to work under nature's teaching, and instead of putting a merely formal dogtooth, as everybody else did at the time, he went down to the woody bank beneath the rocks on which he was building, and he took up a few of the fallen leaves that lay by it, and he set them in his arch, side by side, forever.
And look, that he might show you he had done this, he has made them all of different sizes, just as they lay. And that you might not by any chance miss noticing the variety, he has put a great broad one at the top, and then a little one turned the wrong way next to it, so that you must be blind indeed if you do not understand his meaning. And the healthy change and playfulness of this just does in the stonework what it does in the tree boughs, and is a perpetual refreshment and invigoration. So that, however long you gaze at this simple ornament, and none can be simpler, a village mason could carve it all round the window in a few hours. You are never weary of it. It seems always new. It is true that oval windows of this form are comparatively rare in Gothic work, but as you well know, circular or wheel windows are used constantly, and in most traceries, the apertures are curved and pointed as much at the bottom as the top. So that I believe you will now allow me to proceed upon the assumption that the pointed arch is indeed the best form into which the head either of door or window can be thrown, considered as a means of sustaining weight above it. How these pointed arches ought to be grouped and decorated, I shall endeavour to show you in my next lecture.
More than 30 years later, Ruskin and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings were to campaign unsuccessfully for the roofless nave to remain roofless. By 1886, the capacity of the chancel, which had remained in use after the Reformation, was deemed to be inadequate for a growing parish, and after exploring alternatives, it was decided to bring the nave back into use. And in the right-hand image, you see it splendidly re-roofed. The architect was Robert Rowand Anderson, responsible for training a number of the outstanding arts and crafts architects of the next generation. But he had been trained in the office of Sir George Gilbert Scott and was therefore somewhat suspect in the eyes of Ruskin, who spoke of the vulgar brutality of his proposals, and of the SPAB, who considered in a careful report that the scheme must necessarily be of a destructive character. Photographs of the 1880s show that the nave, which had been unroofed in 1622, had survived remarkably well, as we've seen. In the event, the restoration work was carried out to a high standard of craftsmanship. For example, the superb new roof structures of nave and chancel. There you see the chancel roof on the left. Next, please. The 3 monumental doorways were well and properly conserved, though perhaps not according to our present rights, but they were retained without restoration. There was much gain as well as loss, but to weigh them in the balance could only be a matter of judgment, not of dogma. Moreover, Robert Rowand Anderson was succeeded as architect in the early 20th century by Robert Lorimer, the outstanding architect of the Scottish arts and crafts movement, and Anderson's disciple, who designed canopied stalls, the communion table, a reredos-like screen behind the communion table, and as you see in the photograph there, a superb organ case. I think one of the finest organ cases in Scotland, certainly, and a screen in its traditional position between chancel and nave or crossing, as in many great churches. These works were all carved by the outstanding Clow brothers, William and Alexander Clow, between 1912 and 1914. For Lorimer, they also did much other work, including the stalls of the Knights of the Thistle, attached to the High Kirk of St. Giles. This high level of fine craftsmanship in the cathedral has led to it being described as the Scottish Cathedral of the Arts and Crafts movement. There is an irony here in that if Ruskin's plea not to re-roof the nave had been heeded, there would not have been the opportunity for all this superb craftsmanship in wood, stained glass, and metal. We have abundant evidence of Ruskin's deep knowledge and love of the cathedrals of those European countries to which he was a frequent visitor. A passage in Modern Painters 4, in the chapter entitled The Mountain Glory, mentions a good many of them.
The only artwork that France and England have done nobly is that which is centralized by the Cathedral of Lincoln and the Sainte-Chapelle. We had at that time, we, French and English, but the French first, the incontestable lead among European nations. No 13th century work in Italy is comparable for majesty or conception, or wealth of imaginative detail, to the cathedrals of Chartres, Rheims, Rome, Amiens, Lincoln, Peterborough, Wells, or Lichfield. But every hour of the 14th century saw France and English art in precipitate decline, Italian in steady ascent. And by the time that painting and sculpture had developed themselves in an approximated perfection in the work of Ghirlandaio and Mina di Fiesole, we had in France and England no workman in any art deserving a workman's name. Nothing but skillful masons with more or less the love of the picturesque and redundance of undisciplined imagination, flaming itself away in wild and rich traceries and crowned bosses of grotesque figure sculpture, and expiring at last in barbarous imitation of the perfected skill and erring choice of Renaissance Italy. Painting could not decline, for it had not reached any eminence. The exquisite arts of illumination and glass design had led to no effective results in other materials. They themselves, incapable of any higher perfection than they had reached in the 13th century, perished in the vain endeavor to emulate pictorial excellence. Bad drawing being substituted in books for lovely writing, and opaque precision in glass for transparent power. Nor in any single department of exertion did artists arise of such caliber or class as any of the great Italians. And yet all the while, in literature, we were gradually and steadily advancing in power up to the time of Shakespeare. The Italians, on the contrary, not advancing after the time of Dante.
In the preface to the 1855 second edition of the Seven Lamps of Architecture, Ruskin was to write,
I have now no doubt that the only style proper for modern northern work is the Northern Gothic of the 13th century, as exemplified in England preeminently by the cathedrals of Lincoln and Wells, and in France, those of Paris, Amiens, Chartres, Reims, and Bourges, and by transepts of that of Rouen.
The architect and first principal of the Central School of Arts and Crafts, William Richard Letherby, described the panoply of sculpture on the west front of Wells Cathedral, which we see in front of us now, as being one half of our noblest art, a phrase which has never ceased to move me, one half of our noblest medieval art. A footnote on the same page quotes from a letter of the 10th of April, 1851, to his father, saying of Lincoln Cathedral,
"This is, to my mind, worth all the English cathedrals I've ever seen put together, far beyond my highest expectations. The Galilee, so called, and porch of the small transept on the south side are quite unique, I think, as examples of pure English Gothic in its richest form. And the facade is noble, so thoroughly fine in colour as well as in design, and no small hill neither, which it is set upon, and a delightful old town."
Later he wrote,
"I have always held, and am prepared against all comers to maintain, that the Cathedral of Lincoln is out and out the most precious piece of architecture in the British Islands, and, roughly speaking, worth any two other cathedrals we have got."
This second quotation gave me infinite pleasure during the years when I was the chair of the Fabric Committee of Lincoln Cathedral, and I've often quoted what Ruskin said. But Ruskin here emphasizes that it is the architecture that he's praising so highly, and it always surprises me that he does not remark specifically on the sculpture, both Romanesque and Gothic, which has survived on the west front of Lincoln, and of course, early 13th century at Wells cathedrals. The Wells West Front sculpture was conserved between 1974 and 1986, and that of Lincoln has recently emerged from a long program of conservation and interpretation. It is interesting that he remarks upon the colour of the West Front. Indeed, the limestone of which the cathedral at Lincoln is built does have a most beautiful tonality. It comes from a quarry just 1 mile north of the cathedral, which still belongs to the Dean and Chapter. It is not clear, though, whether Ruskin was aware that all ancient architecture and sculpture was originally decorated with painted colours and gilding. Abundant evidence survives, but is not immediately obvious except at close quarters. The next reading introduces us to an important aspect of Ruskin's thinking, which was to blossom in Venice, and that is the importance of recording our historic buildings' heritage.
I must here also deprecate an idea which is often taken up by hasty readers of the Stones of Venice, namely, that I suppose Venetian architecture the most noble of all the schools of Gothic. I have great respect for Venetian Gothic, but only as one among many early schools. My reason for devoting so much time to Venice was not that her architecture is the best in existence, but that it exemplifies in the smallest compass the most interesting facts of architectural history. The Gothic of Verona is far nobler than that of Venice, and that of Florence nobler than that of Verona. For our own immediate purposes, that of Notre Dame of Paris is the noblest of all, and the greatest service which can at present be rendered to architecture is the careful delineation of the details of the cathedrals above named by means of photography. I would particularly desire to direct the attention of amateur photographers to this task, earnestly requesting them to bear in mind that while a photograph of landscape is merely an amusing toy, one of early architecture is a precious historical document, and that this architecture should be taken not merely when it presents itself under picturesque general forms, but stone by stone and sculpture by sculpture, seizing every opportunity afforded by scaffolding to approach it closely, and putting the camera in any position that will command the sculpture, wholly without regard to the resultant distortions of the vertical lines. Such distortion can always be allowed for if once the details are completely obtained. It would be still more patriotic in lovers of architecture to obtain casts of the sculptures of the 13th century, wherever an opportunity occurs, and to place them where they would be easily accessible to the ordinary workman. The Architectural Museum at Westminster is one of the institutions which it appears to me most desirable to enrich in this manner.
Ruskin naturally followed his own advice. For example, detailed photographs of the cathedral at Amiens were taken on Ruskin's instructions for the book, The Bible of Amiens, published between 1880 and 1885. Some of these superb photographs are reproduced in volume 33 of the library edition of Ruskin's works, where the editors E.T. Cook and Alexander Wedderburn describe that work as one of the central books in Ruskin's Gospel. Intriguingly, in the introduction to that volume, the editors tell us that in 1879-1880, a welter of Ruskin societies began to be founded, for example, in Manchester, Glasgow, and London. Some were specifically called Ruskin Reading Guilds, with a realization such as we have in our own day, and indeed this evening, that to read Ruskin aloud is a particular kind of pleasure, challenging, informative, and pleasing to the ear when performed successfully. In the chapter called Interpretations, Ruskin tumbles over himself with excitement about the wood carving in Amiens Cathedral, and it is no accident, I'm sure, that plate 7 is of the choir stalls. He tells us,
"Whatever you wish to see or are forced to leave unseen at Amiens, if the overwhelming responsibilities of your existence and the inevitable necessities of precipitate locomotion in their fulfillment have left you so much as 1/4 of an hour not out of breath for the contemplation of the capital of Picardy, give it wholly to the cathedral choir. Aisles and porches, lancet windows and roses you can see elsewhere as well as here, but such carpenter's work you cannot. It is late, fully developed flamboyant just past the 15th century, and has some Flemish stolidity mixed with the playing French fire of it. But the wood carving was the Picard's joy from his youth up, and so far as I know, there is nothing else so beautiful cut out of the goodly trees of the world. Sweet and young-grained wood it is, oak trained and chosen for such work, sound now as 400 years since. Under the carver's hand it seems to be cut like clay, to fold like silk, to grow like living branches, to leap like living flame. Canopy crowning canopy, pinnacle piercing pinnacle. It shoots and wreathes itself into an enchanted glade, inextricable, imperishable, fuller of leafage than any forest, and fuller of story than any book."
In this chapter, Ruskin writes with particular appreciation of Viollet-le-Duc, and especially of his Dictionary of French Architecture from the 11th to the 16th century, published between 1854 and 68. Viollet-le-Duc had described the cathedral at Amiens as the Parthenon of Gothic architecture. It is clear that Ruskin has made scrupulous and exhaustive use of Viollet-le-Duc's dictionary to give us an authoritative account of the sculpture on the west front. In this respect, Ruskin's work functions or can function as a guidebook. Since Ruskin's day, the identities of more and more of the master craftspeople who built Europe's cathedrals have come to light. Through greater access to cathedral and other private and public archives. But Ruskin engagingly introduces us to Robert the Builder.
The actual man who built it scarcely cared to tell you he did so, nor do the historians brag of him. Any quantity of heraldries of naves and faience you may find in what they call their history. But this is probably the first time you ever read the name of Robert de Lusace. I say he scarcely cared. We are not sure if he cared at all. He signed his name nowhere that I can hear of. You may perhaps read some recent initials cut by English remarkable visitors desirous of immortality, here and there about the edifice. But Robert the Builder, or at least the master of building, cut his on no stone of it.
There follows an exhaustive account of the iconography of the sculpture of the cathedral, and especially of the west front, with due appreciation of Viollet-le-Duc. The following passage exhibits a remarkable softening of Ruskin's formerly rigid Protestant stance.
And now, last of all, if you care to see it, we will go into the Madonna's porch. Only, if you come at all, good Protestant feminine reader, come civilly, and be pleased to recollect, if you have in known history material for recollection, this, or if you cannot recollect, be you very solemnly assured of this, that neither Madonna worship nor lady worship of any sort, whether of dead ladies or living ones, ever did any human creature any harm, but that money worship, wig worship, cocked hat and feather worship, plate worship, pot worship and pipe worship have done and are doing a great deal. And that any of these and all are quite millionfold more offensive to the God of heaven and earth and the stars than all the absurdest and lovingest mistakes made by any generations of his simple children about what the Virgin Mother could or would or might do or feel for them.
In trying to understand the relationship between the craftsman and the theologian in the Middle Ages, we may recall what we learned in our first session about the spectacular new west doorway of York Minster, completed around the year 2000. One of the York Minster clergy, Canon John Toy, who was in fact called the canon theologian, drew up the programme for the iconography. He discussed it in depth and over a period of thoughtful reflection with the designer, our dear friend Rory Young. Rory then created the maquettes for the approval process. The maquettes were then copied in the Minster Stone Yard by the very capable stone carvers there, and the result was a triumph, rich in both beauty and meaning, as you see so very well in the right-hand image on the screen. We have to imagine something very like that happening in the Middle Ages. Now, our journey is due to end in Venice, and so it is time to move on from France to Italy, beginning in Lucca. Lucca is a city which drew a very rich and complex response from Ruskin, of which it is only possible to touch the surface here. In the epilogue to the Stones of Venice, Ruskin says,
"From Genoa, I went on in that spring of 1845 to Lucca, where the tomb of Ilario di Cavetto had once ordered the course of my life for me, and from that day I left the upholsterer's business in art to those who trade in it, and have guided my work and limited my teaching only by the sacred laws of truth and devotion, which created the perfect schools of Christian art in Florence and Venice."
Ruskin's editors of the library edition of the works guide us immediately to Fors Clavigera, letter 45, where we find the following.
30 years ago, I began my true study of Italian and all other art, here beside the statue of Ilaria di Caretto, recumbent on her tomb. It turned me from the study of landscape to that of life, being then myself in the fullest strength of labour and joy of hope. And I was thinking last night that the drawing which I am now trying to make of it, in the weakness and despair of declining age, might possibly be the last I should make before quitting the study of Italian and even all other art forever.
In Modern Painters 2, there is an extensive passage in which Ruskin describes the tomb, but in a footnote is the letter which Ruskin wrote to his father on the 6th of May, 1845, and is even more moving in its freshness of response.
When the rose tints leave the clouds, I go and spend a quarter of an hour beside the tomb of Ilaria di Caretto. It is in the cathedral. She was the second wife of Paolo Guinigi, Signoria of Lucca in 1430. He left the Lucchi several good laws which they have still, but in a war with the Florentines, he was betrayed by his allies and died in a prison at Pavia. The tower of his palace fortress is overgrown with copsewood, but the iron rings to which his horses used to be fastened still are seen along the length of the street before it, and the hooks by which the silken draperies were suspended on festa days. This, his second wife, died young, and her monument is by Jacopo della Quercia, erected soon after her death. She is lying on a simple pillow with a hound at her feet. Her dress is of the simplest middle-aged character, folding closely over the bosom and tight to the arms, clasped about the neck. Round her head is a circular fillet with 3 star-shaped flowers. From under this, the hair falls like that of the Magdalene, its undulation just felt as it touches the cheek, and no more. The arms are not folded, nor the hands clasped nor raised. Her arms are laid softly at length upon her body, and her hands cross as they fall. The drapery flows over the feet and half hides the hound. It is impossible to tell you the perfect sweetness of the lips and closed eyes, nor the solemnity of the seal of death which is set upon the whole figure. The sculpture, as art, is in every way perfect. Truth itself, truth selected with inconceivable refinement of feeling. The cast of the drapery, severe natural simplicity and perfect grace, I never saw equalled, nor the fall of the hands. You expect every instant, nay, rather you seem to see every instant, the last sinking into death. There is no decoration nor work about it, not even enough protection. You may stand beside it, leaning on the pillow and watching the twilight fade off the sweet dead lips and arched eyes in their sealed close.
In the Guild's collection of paintings is a watercolour by Ruskin of exquisite quality of the Church of Santa Maria della Spina, Pisa, Italy, dated 1845, which was shown in the 2019 Bicentenary exhibition, a collaboration with 2 Temple Place, entitled John Ruskin, The Power of Seeing. As its name suggests, the church contained what legend had it was a thorn from the crown of thorns, with which Jesus was crowned for mockery on the day of his crucifixion, as also did the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris and many other shrine-like churches. There exist also 2 daguerreotypes, a medium in which Ruskin took a great deal of interest and practiced himself. Having first drawn and been drawn to Santa Maria della Spina in 1840, he now heard with alarm on his 1845 visit that the church had been proposed for demolition to widen the quay on which it stood. the quay existed because Pisa was still at that point a considerable port. In the event, the solution agreed was for the church to be taken down and re-erected further from the edge of the quay, in some respects with remarkable skill. Ruskin himself witnessed a barbaric act of destruction so great that it was still rankling in his mind as a terrible act of vandalism when he came to write letter number 20 of Fors Clavigera in August 1872, the year in which he took up residence in Brant Wood.
It was some comfort to me, that 2nd of May last at Pisa, to watch the workman's ashamed face as he struck the old marble cross to pieces. Stolidly and languidly he dealt the blows, down-looking, so far as in any wise sensitive, ashamed, and well he might be. It was a wonderful thing to see done. This Pisan chapel, first built in 1230, then called the Oracle or Oratory, Oraculum, well, Oratorium, of the Blessed Mary of the New Bridge, afterwards called the Sea Bridge, Ponte a Mare, was a shrine like that of ours on the Bridge of Wakefield, a boatman's praying place. You may still see, or might 10 years since have seen, the use of such a thing at the mouth of Boulogne Harbour, where the mackerel boats went out in a fleet at early dawn. There used to be a little shrine at the end of the longest pier, and as the Bonne Espérance, or Grâce de Dieu, or Vierge Marie, or Notre-Dame des Dunes, or Reine des Anges, rose on the first surge of the open sea, the crews bared their heads and prayed for a few seconds. So also the Pisan oarsmen looked back to their shrine, many pinnacled, standing out from the quay above the river as they dropped down Arno under their sea bridge, bound for the Isles of Greece. Later, in the 15th century, there was laid up in it a little branch of the crown of thorns of the Redeemer, which a merchant had brought home, enclosed in the little urn of Beyond Sea, ultramarine, and its name was changed to St. Mary's of the Thorn.
Ruskin had already referred to the incident in Fors Clavigera letter number 18 of June 1872.
Before we put aside Dante for today, just note, Father, this, that while he has sharp punishment for thieves, forgers and peculators, thieves being changed into serpents, the forgers covered with leprosy and the peculators boiled in pitch, he has no punishment for bad workmen, no Tuscan mind at that day being able to conceive such a ghastly sin as a man's doing bad work willfully. And indeed, I think the Tuscan mind, and in some degree the Piedmontese, retain some vestige of this old temper. For though not a fortnight since, on the 3rd of May, the cross of marble in the arched spandrel next to the east end of the chapel of the Thorn at Pisa was dashed to pieces before my eyes as I was drawing it for my class in heritage by a stonemason, that his master might be paid for making a new one. I have no doubt the new one will be as honestly like the old as master and man can make it, and Mr. Murray's guide will call it a judicious restoration.
I cannot resist showing a couple of images of Santa Maria della Spina, which I took myself. It is famously difficult to disassemble a building and put it back together again, Humpty Dumpty fashion, successfully. It can only be done through the agency of highly skilled and well-directed craftsmanship, which clearly was available in 1840s Pisa. However, there is, it seems to me, a considerable difference between the exterior and the interior. The exterior has a great deal of stone replacement and is essentially a 19th century building, but inside, both the ancient floor, which isn't apparent in that photograph, and the ancient roof structure, painted roof structure, seem to be fairly authentic. It's a really strange essay in restoration. Deserves, I think, more study by those people here and elsewhere in a position to do that. It would be lovely to have a building archaeologist like Tom Adderman, who will be our speaker at the Falkland Society next month, for example, to let his mind play on what actually has happened and to see what documentation exists of it. Next, please. Before leaving Pisa and Lucca, both cities which had a special resonance for Ruskin, we may contemplate the beautiful drawing of Lucca from the ramparts, 1845, dating from one of those 1845 visits. It is a remarkably affectionate drawing, I feel. Graphite and ink on grey-brown paper of the sort of vernacular building which Ruskin plainly loved, and which is a significant aspect of his love of the handmade. It is not only the work of ingenious and highly skilled craftspeople that he admires, but the work of untrained or semi-trained people using their local materials and skills, probably gathered from a few meters away, localness being a key element in vernacular building construction. Between his first visit in 1835 and his last visit in 1888, Ruskin visited Venice a number of times, including 1841, when he declared the city to be the paradise of cities. Then in 1845, when he spent 7 months based in Venice, then his second long stay with his wife of 6 years, Effie Gray, during which he was working with incredible commitment on the recording of Venice's endangered monuments and writing the 2nd and 3rd volumes of the Stones of Venice. In the 2nd volume of the Stones of Venice, in the chapter on St. Mark's, Ruskin takes us on a walk towards the Basilica, to the point where
the vast tower of St. Mark, that is the Campanile, seems to lift itself visibly forth from the level field of checkered stones, and on each side, the countless arches prolong themselves into ranged symmetry, as if the rugged and irregular houses that pressed together above us in the dark alley had been struck back into sudden obedience and lovely order, and all their rude casements and broken walls had been transformed into arches charged with goodly sculpture and fluted shafts of delicate stone.
And well may they fall back, but beyond those troops of ordered arches there rises a vision out of the earth. The great square seems to have opened from it in a kind of awe that we may see it far away. A multitude of pillars and white domes, clustered into a long, low pyramid of coloured light. A treasure heap, it seems, partly of gold and partly of opal and mother of pearl, hollowed beneath into 5 great vaulted porches, sealed with fair mosaic and beset with sculpture of alabaster, clear as amber and delicate as ivory. Sculpture fantastic and involved, of palm leaves and lilies, and grapes and pomegranates, and birds clinging and fluttering among the branches, all twined together into an endless network of buds and plumes. And in the midst of it, the solemn forms of angels sceptred and robed to the feet, and leaning to each other across the gates, their figures indistinct among the gleaming of the golden ground through the leaves beside them, interrupted and dim, like the morning light as it faded back among the branches of Eden when first its gates were angel-guarded long ago. And round the walls of the porches there are set pillars of variegated stones, jasper and porphyry, and deep green serpentine spotted with flakes of snow, and marbles that half refuse and half yield to the sunshine, Cleopatra-like, their bluest veins to kiss. The shadow, as it steals back from them, revealing line after line of azure undulation, as a receding tide leaves the wave's sand, their capitals rich with interwoven tracery, rooted knots of herbage and drifting leaves of acanthus and vine, and mystical signs all beginning and ending in the cross. And above them, in the broad archivolts, a continuous chain of language and of life, angels and the signs of heaven and the labours of men, each in its appointed season upon the earth. And above these, another range of glittering pinnacles mixed with white arches edged with scarlet flowers, a confusion of delight amidst which the breasts of the Greek horses are seen blazing in their breadth of golden strength. And the St. Mark's lion lifted on a blue field covered with stars, until at last, as if in ecstasy, the crests of the arches break into a marble foam and toss themselves far into the blue sky in flashes and wreaths of sculptured spray, as if the breakers of the Lido shore had been frostbound before they fell, and the sea nymphs had inlaid them with coral and amethyst.
This is surely one of the most beautiful passages in the Stones of Venice, and in it Ruskin invokes the richness of the materials and the intricacy of the delicate carvings on the west front of St. Mark's. In the first session last December on Ruskin and the Crafts, we registered the importance of that chapter of the Stones of Venice called The Nature of Gothic, and in particular what Ruskin says about the craftsman and the attitudes he should have towards his work. In the passage which follows, Ruskin articulates another of his constant teachings, which is that we should go to nature for inspiration.
I say first that the Gothic builders were of that central class which unites fact with design, but that the part of the work which was more especially their own was the truthfulness. Their power of artistical invention or arrangement was not greater than that of Romanesque and Byzantine workmen. By those workmen, they were taught the principles, and from them received their models of design. But to the ornamental feeling and rich fancy of the Byzantine, the Gothic builder added a love of fact which is never found in the South. Both Greek and Roman used conventional foliage in their ornament, passing into something that was not foliage at all, knotting itself into strange cup-like buds or clusters, and growing out of lifeless rods instead of stems. The Gothic sculptor received these types, at first, as things that ought to be, just as we have a second time received them. But he could not rest in them. He saw there was no veracity in them, no knowledge, no vitality. Do what he could not help liking the true leaves better. And cautiously, a little at a time, he put more of nature into his work, until at last it was all true, retaining nevertheless every valuable character of the original well-disciplined and designed arrangement.
So ends the fourth, and for the time being, the final exploration of the theme of Ruskin and the Crafts. It is a rich theme, and one way or another, I hope that as a guild, we shall take it further. The survival of traditional craft skills was an issue even in Ruskin's day, and as we have seen in the second of our readings, he took steps to ensure the survival of certain traditional crafts in the English Lake District where he lived: spinning and weaving, wood carving, lace making, pottery, and so on. I want to thank all those who have, in all 4 sessions, given time to the careful preparation of their readings. It has been a delight for me to be the enabler of these sessions, and so I've been conscious of the effort that everyone has put into it. Thank you for that. I want to conclude, as I said I would, by referring once more to Rory Young, who achieved so much as a master craftsperson, conservator and sculptor. He was a dear friend of mine for exactly 40 years, and I shall miss him very much. In December, those of us who were taking part in the reading session with him knew that he was dying, but he was determined with his usual courage to take part. The result was vintage Rory, beautifully spoken and with points eloquently made. Also participating in that session was Tracy Shepherd, distinguished glass engraver, who's just fulfilled her year as Master of the Art Workers Guild. And she wrote a letter after Rory's death, which reads as follows. He was a truly delightful man, gentle, caring, highly intelligent, immensely talented. The world has lost a treasure, but he has left us all so much treasure here on earth. His spirit will live on amongst all who knew and loved him, and many will come to admire him in the coming years through all the wonderful work he has done. So thank you, those of you who are present and those who have been present for the other 3 sessions, and for all the readers or speakers. Thank you all so much for your active listening as well as for your active speaking. It has been a real pleasure. I'm looking to Simon. Are we able to have a discussion now, Simon, or is it, as it were, technically difficult?
No, it isn't technically difficult. I'm delighted to say, as he did at a previous session, that Timothy Meek has left a really rich response throughout the reading. So anybody do open up the chat and have a look. And then some very nice comments, Jill and Michelle, and some clapping hands from Nick Boys. So there are a few things that Timothy has said, which are lovely and sometimes provocative, sometimes fully in agreement. And just towards the end, Nick has written, when you were talking about the building in Pisa and the rebuilding and so on, he's written, demolition is vandalism and reckless climate change, which of course is very topical at the moment with that case that SPAB are fighting. Or is it SAVE are fighting about the Marks and Spencer building in
everybody,
London?
or everybody should be anyway.
Exactly. I think there's the very first thing Timothy says is very interesting. When you were talking about his Scottish heritage and quoting from Collingwood, he writes, I think we need to be clear about what we mean by Scots men. These are Scots, but men wedded to unionism. So there's a good provocation from the word go. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that, or if you want, Timothy wants to say any more on that subject. If you do, by all means, unmute yourself. But I think it's an interesting point, and again, highly relevant currently, the state of Scottish, the strength of feeling.
Yes, you know, I don't think we can ignore that. I mean, Scott and Ruskin were dedicated to the union, and that has a profound implication, certainly in Scotland, where my research is based, on how Scotland looks now. Actually, it is as simple as that. And we do live with a Scotland that is very much stripped of its surface finishes, and in some respect, in doing so, it's stripped of its functional past. And in stripping it of its functional past, we also strip it of its presentation. And the presentation and the functionality and an independent Scotland can be viewed in tandem. It's a point that Charles McKean was very keen to stress as well.
Thank you. Tim, something where I suspect we are the possessors of fairly similar views is the point about the way in which medieval and all ancient architecture was treated with colour and often gilding. It is extraordinary to me that Ruskin never ever betrays any knowledge of that.
Mhm.
Would you agree?
I would agree, and just something that I address within my thesis, and there is a real sense with it, well, really from the 1750s right through to the mid 19th century of polychromy being, I don't think it's too strong to say suppressed. There is that real sense to it, because of course, anybody who looks as closely and in the right places at Ruskin cannot have, they must have seen it, and yet he ignores it, and I find that remarkable.
Yeah, I agree. And it's possible that he didn't often, or perhaps even, of course, he's known to have climbed on scaffolding to record Venice, isn't he? So, but I don't suppose he ever had the privilege or opportunity to go up on the west front of Wells or Amiens or Chartres or any of the cathedrals he speaks affectionately about. But if he had, he would have perhaps had the opportunity to see that in those little hollows are still plenty of samples of medieval paint on a layer of gesso.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michelle, I haven't read your long essay. Would you like to speak to us? You've got so many interesting thoughts and ideas and such a passion for Ruskin.
Shall I just read what I wrote?
Yes, please do. It's a good starting point.
Which was to say, thank you. That was so interesting. And the reading and the curation of the readings and the images. What I really wanted to say is that it's very alchemical of Ruskin that he writes about stone, but what he evokes is love and life. He's the only writer I know who can draw life and love out of stone. And for me, the head of Ilaria di Corretto, it recalls the head of St. Ursula on her pillow, and also Ruskin's sketch of Rose Latouche on her deathbed. It's the same image. And it seems through his life, from his encounter with Ilaria when he was young, right through to 1875 and Rose on her pillow, it was there. And for me, there's something very touching about writing, about how he could stand close to Ilaria with no barrier between one's eyes and the perfect sweetness of lips and closed eyes. It seemed to me very wistful, not presuming for more, but just wishing to gaze without a barrier, which was something he was denied in the case of Rose.
This is so memorable, so lovely. Thank you. Andreas, it's really good to see you all the way from Dresden.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Maybe I can make a small contribution to the suppression of color in medieval art.
Please.
Maybe it comes from Dresden somehow, because there was Mr. Winkelmann who studied the antique sculptures in Greece and in Rome, and of course all these archaeologic foundings were without color, because within these 2,000 years, or no, 1,800 years, the color has faded and all was white marble from Greece. And this whiteness was very liked by the people of his age, by his and then came up this incredible copying with plaster. And if you go to the Victoria and Albert, there's a whole museum which is completely white. And so somehow we forgot a little bit about the coloring, because all antique sculptures seemed to be white. And even for me, was a big a surprise when I saw my first exposition on the color in antique sculptures in the late 1980s. Yeah. And so it's sort of a misunderstanding, and sort of a it comes from the reception of antique sculptures, and then and the medieval was a little bit in the shadow, and also made of sandstone, made of European stones, which are darker, and so yeah, it's from the white copies maybe. this suppression, so-called.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
remind us that Ruskin was an arch taker of casts, wasn't he? Or anyway, causing other people to make casts of architectural details. And the Guild of St. George owns quite a few of them. And sometimes some of them are on display at Millennium Gallery in Sheffield. Nick, I bet you're longing to say something.
I am, thank you. Evidence is everything, isn't it? And Ruskin speaks loudly about authenticity and evidence. And I've been very fortunate during my career to actually scale the West Front of Wells and see for myself the polychrome, evidence of polychrome left in the sort of tear ducts of the sculpture. And when you know where to look, that's where you look. And it's an utter joy to get a glimpse of just how spectacular. Salisbury Cathedral as well, with those amazing compound piers that are picked out in colour, that go off like fireworks. Yeah, who scrubbed those off?
Marcus, would you like to say anything in this debate? You have the unique gift of being both a very distinguished intellectual, if I may say so, but you also work with your hands. You love to work with lime, for example, I know, and you were speaking about timber that you were buying earlier this evening. What do you make of all this? And especially whether, you know, Ruskin is that bit too distant from the actual craft work to understand exactly what goes on in the creative act.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I suppose two things came to mind as we were reading. One was, I mean, I'm a literary critic, so I apart from being someone who likes to work with their hands, and I was just struck by the ways in which Ruskin was not just describing architecture, but trying to represent its rhythm through the rhythm of his prose. And as I think you said, Pete, during the rehearsal, there are lots of cross currents and cross rhythms going on, which as a reader you try to represent. But I was just sense the reading experience was in its way architectural. The other thing I wanted to just dwell on was something I was really glad you brought out at the beginning of this structure, was just this sense of Ruskin's love of and fascination with the vernacular, and the Swiss cottage was the example given at the beginning. And in my own kind of wanderings around Swiss valleys, I've always been struck by the sense in which Swiss cottages are devoted in a very fundamental way to functionality, so that things like sledges and scythes and cowbells be hung from the outside of the cottage, the chalet, in a way that, I don't know, it seems to bespeak a kind of different relationship with surroundings and with a different relationship with between the inside and the outside of a building. And I think you're right that Ruskin on some level is not entirely keyed into the kind of practical dimension, but then his eye has this habit of noticing things that actually takes you closer sometimes, I think, to the kind of lived experience of these buildings and the ways that they were constructed and used, that even, you know, someone maybe who's very practically involved might not notice. Or so I find him a puzzle in that respect. I can't believe that he always understood how things were made or the processes behind them, but his forms of description seem somehow suggest a kind of preternatural understanding of those processes.
I think it's a good point actually that you make, Marcus, because as I was saying before we started the session, I took the time today just to walk past the Palazzo Ducale, and I thought how wonderful that those things are still there to see. And it's a privilege, I feel, that sometimes when reading parts of the letters, I think, well, I walked that walk today. So, physically walking the same thing. But actually what you said about the eye is so key, because there was I looking at specific details on the capitals of the Palazzo Ducale, sort of fighting my way through hordes of people who, you know, are doing everything but, including sort of lying in the sun, taking pictures, I don't know, changing their bags over, anything but looking at what I was looking at. And so that sort of links me to what Nicholas said, which I think I've just written it down. So that knowing where to look is key. And the fact that he said he goes and he can look in the tear ducts of the sculptures. I'm going to try and look in the tear ducts of some of the sculptures next time I get the chance. But yes, I mean, observation is everything.
Memorably said. Now there are two Nicholases present. Nicholas Mander, would you like to say something?
I think I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
No, I think this thing of colour in architecture goes back conventionally to the Reformation, so where we were whitewashing all the wall paintings, and it's something very strong. Is it to do with the Calvinist approach, maybe, that you don't find it in Lutheran churches in Sweden, for instance, where a lot of the wall paintings are there's a much greater sense of colour than we have in this side. But yes, I always think it's magnificent, like that description of the west front of the San Marco with the lion on the top and the blue ground, the sparkling stars. I mean, it's so full of poetry, isn't it?
Wonderful.
It captures with those rhythms the architecture of the building. Yes, it's really one I can see why Proust was enamored of Ruskin's prose. And, but yes, I think we lack the. I didn't realize that that's the Church of the Spine. What's it called? Had been so damaged in the removal of it. It's a lovely church. I remember.
Isn't it?
So lovely images, by the way. I'm really warm to the text and the visual commentary.
Well, huge thanks to Ross and Peter for sourcing the images today. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been great fun.
Many of them take.
I'm just wondering if Jim Spriggs, my old friend Jim Spriggs, who's masquerading under the name of Sal Kingsley, would like to say something. Jim, are you still there? Hello, Jim? Oh, perhaps not. Anyway, why have we done this? Are you going to say that?
No, you say.
I just want to say, why have we had these 4 reading sessions? I think first and foremost, because we all love Ruskin, the writer, even though sometimes he says very exasperating or difficult to understand things. But, you know, when you hear passages like the great one that Marcus read and the great one that Déirdre read this evening, you just realize how much there is to enjoy and venerate in him as a writer. So we've enjoyed putting on these sessions. Last year we did 4 sessions rather similar to this, but entirely about Venice. And we wanted to end with Venice because Venice has always to be in our minds. The city is in crisis. Many initiatives are going on, but you know, the problems have not gone away. So what can the Guild of St. George do? I think one of the things it preeminently can do is to encourage people to read Ruskin again. He's the sort of person that people love to write about. I have a whole library of books, and I'm sure several other people here do too, about Ruskin or interpreting Ruskin. But we must constantly, I think, go back to his own texts. And so we tried to choose passages not so well known on the whole, and stories not so well known on the whole, so as to introduce people to different threads of his thinking. And it seems to me that Ruskin and the Crafts is one very well deserving of our attention. And as I said in concluding the reading, we must do more. It's a really important theme. But as I found in preparing the script, it's not that easy a theme to get a grip on. We've done our best, and it's been very pleasant and interesting and good. So anyway, thank you all very much. And Simon, do you want to say anything at the very, very end?
I do.
Thank you so much for looking after us.
You're welcome. It's hair raising every time, but that's largely to do with the internet. I just want to thank you, Peter, in turn. You've been very generous with your thanks tonight, but you conceived of the whole series as you did the Venetian series. I'm sure other series will come in the future. And your passion for it and the sincerity of the endeavor, that there is so much richness and joy and poetry and relevance in so much of what Ruskin had to say and how inspiring it can be. So thank you on behalf of the Guild, but thank you also on behalf of all of us who've attended these sessions for the incredible work you've done. It's really, in its own way, scholarship of a very profound nature to synthesize and turn it into something coherent. And thank you, Ross. I know you always support Peter's endeavors behind the scenes, but tonight a reader, but also doing so much technically and with the images. And thank you again on behalf of the Guild to Marcus and to Déirdre for making up the quartet who've read to us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.